1907. Amidst the central hub of Pittsburgh, within a foundry, the atmosphere itself appears flammable. The boiler flares, emitting warmth so powerful it burns the flesh. Clouds of dark vapor obstruct every inhalation. The metal beams nearly too luminous to observe. The ground quivers and the gust tastes of cinders and ore. Laborers survive 12-hour stints, toiling without pause, merely inches from naked blazes. Their physiques and spirits stretched to the collapse limit. Was this mastery, or simply the toll of manufacturing growth? In this presentation, we shall demonstrate precisely how this was a framework founded on arduous, perilous toil before we commence. If these chronicles of the past suit you, I would truly value it if you would join the channel and inform me in the remarks section regarding which calamities I ought to explore thereafter. This is the account of primitive smelting works that functioned incessantly for decades, containing liquefied metal at fatal intensities all day and night, and endangering the life of every person who entered the premises. During the peak of the second manufacturing era, smelting chambers were not regarded as menaces, they were described as triumphs. In 1884, one of the land's most esteemed metal crafters addressed his colleagues and characterized the kiln, not as a peril but as something akin to a life's mission. All those involved in the smelting chamber profession perceive the allure associated with the trade. It is robust and firm, yet possesses enough enchantment and fervor to highlight its appeal. The facility itself is magnificent, from the respiring, throbbing apparatus to the intricate processing traits of the melting pot. What to the uninformed is the frightening brilliance of flaming vapor, throwing irregular silhouettes against the firmament, is to the smelter operator the indicator of the quality of the task being executed, down where the impurities are being detached from the ore. The sheer scale of the enterprise itself is captivating. The utility of the final goods, the steadfastness of focus required, the bravery, vigor, and talent necessitated, the chance to satisfy commendable aspirations, all merge to make one take pride in the vocation. This is why this citation is significant as I observe it now. Those expressions appear excessively idealistic. However, in their era, they were realistic. The kiln was relied upon because it had to be, and once it was ignited, halting it turned into the most hazardous choice possible. Thus, the chamber stayed active, since pausing could be deadly. During the early 20th century, smelting kilns were engineered to function without any break. Once they were fired up, what seemed like routine work from the exterior was within. The partitions, a delicate equilibrium sustained by unrelenting warmth. United States ironsmiths had discovered that chilling a kiln was not a mere intermission but also a hazard. Stone barriers widened and shifted under thermal force. When that warmth disappeared, shrinking could rupture the guts beyond any fix. Rekindling after a total cool-down frequently necessitated reconstructing from the core outwards. The strain on the assembly lines converted this situation into official rule. Based on national reports circulated back then, a massive American smelting kiln was able to yield over 400 tons of crude iron in one day. But let us halt for a brief moment. If you are like myself, you might be curious what crude iron is and why it was so titled. Pig iron is the result of processing metal ore, utilizing a high-carbon propellant and deoxidizer, like coke commonly with calcium carbonate as a purifying agent. Coal and hard coal are likewise utilized as propellants and deoxidizers. It is created by processing metal ore in smelting chambers, or by processing titanium iron ore in powered kilns, and it is utilized within unified metal mill hubs. The label pig iron originates from the era when molten ore was poured into blocks, prior to being fed into the steel foundry. The casings were arranged in grit patches, in a way that they were supplied by a shared channel. The cluster of casings resembled a brood of nursing swine, with the blocks being termed pigs and the channel the sow. Now, if you recall what I previously mentioned, a smelting chamber in this period could yield 400 tons daily. That level of production could never be reached without persistent, Functioning every dormant hour leads squarely to wasted supplies and wasted income. This implied the kiln stayed burning through every conceivable situation, covering tempests, worker deficits, and hardware fatigue. Teams toiled day and night to maintain the draft and keep the liquid metal flowing even as alerts surfaced. Tiny fissures, strange tremors, or shifts in hue were recorded, but unless they indicated immense hazards, they would seldom interrupt the output. It is easy to perceive how eventually, during this mode of endless activity, the kiln technicians would arrive at a critical juncture. Did they deem it more secure to gamble on architectural ruin by permitting the blaze to expire, or did they believe that it could remain intact for another day? Inside the chimney, clashing powers never ceased. Searing draft surged upward while heaps of ore, fuel and calcium carbonate fell, which generated interior loads that strained every link and weld. Lacking the detectors that exist with contemporary engineering, decisions depended on sheer expertise instead of data. Looking back, I can perceive how this was not simple recklessness. The designers, under massive strain to hit targets, grasped the peril. So the framework could not permit being excessively guarded. But as we are about to observe, this was not even the worst aspect of it. Peril commenced long before the kiln. It followed laborers all the way to their residences. By the close of the century, steel settlements expanded from the chimneys, placing everyday existence within range of incessant warmth and din. In 19 districts emerged beside foundries, since foundries required laborers. At all times, residences were situated under a floating haze, their casements clattering as explosions thundered through the night. Kinships acquired the ability to slumber through the quakes. While the heavens radiated crimson after dusk, the chamber never halted, and neither did the settlements constructed around it. Toil inside the facility mirrored the same cadence. 12-hour stints were standard, ordered by the requirement to keep metal shifting without any pause. Men traversed bridges greasy with moisture and residue, steered by their recollection and routine more than vision. But why would this persist? The magnitude of the trade magnified that vulnerability beyond what we could ever conceive. Based on various citations, the United States yielded over 13 million tons of crude iron in 19%, a volume that necessitated hundreds of chambers, functioning non-stop throughout manufacturing districts. Every single one held the same innate peril. Midway through a stint, as the warmth pushed against their flesh, and their hearing throbbed from a discharge, the laborers would find themselves posing the same queries. Repeatedly were these settings locations of labor or regions of disaster, awaiting an occurrence. I am uncertain regarding you, but I would not have managed to tolerate this sort of existence. Day after day, the dangers were not always sensational. Toxic vapors leaked from fissures. Extreme warmth enfeebled scaffolds and exhaustion blunted resolve. Many mishaps often developed gradually, the consequence of gathered tension rather than an abrupt breakdown. Specialists and directors were not oblivious to these perils. Industry publications of the era cautioned constantly about kiln nearness and laborer fatigue, yet provided few substitutes within the current framework. Simply stated, output requirements surpassed shifting or re-engineering. Residing near the chamber meant tolerate its presence as habitual. The brilliance, the dine, the peril, all blended into everyday habits. Tragedy was not a sudden jolt. It was the very atmosphere they inhaled, integrated into every minute of the day, constantly. And that is what makes this following segment so horrifying to envision. As I just noted, the kiln did not need to explode to destroy. In the years preceding the Great War, danger drifted hauntingly through ironworks, transported by a draft that appeared benign, but was anything but by 1912. Engineers were publicly cautioned that the most fatal menace within a smelting facility could not be perceived at all. Furnace fumes wandered through gaps in stone walls and unstable connections in plumbing. It was a byproduct of iron production discharged, recycled and frequently poorly managed. Historical technical documents describe this gas as having nearly 20 to 30% carbon monoxide, a level capable of slaying within minutes in cramped areas. The men toiling near vents and heaters acquired the skill to detect alert signs, though usually once it was too far gone, migraine, vertigo, and disorientation would commence. Initially, many faints were misidentified as thermal exhaustion, particularly during those lengthy stints when tiredness was already anticipated. I would suppose that halfway through a shift, a laborer's focus would drift and ponder thoughts such as, how many fatalities were attributed to frailty, when in truth the genuine trigger was toxin? The layout of primitive facilities made flight difficult. Vapor conduits were positioned above. Taps dripped and airflow relied on natural currents, rather than automated systems. A minor shift in the breeze's course. You could shove smoke back into production zones without any alert. Technical periodicals from the era constantly warned that carbon monoxide was scentless and tricky. Laborers could not detect the smell, could not view it, and frequently did not grasp the risk until they fainted. To make the situation even more dire, salvage efforts occasionally took further lives when others dove in without safety gear. What is your opinion? Were these deaths triggered by inadequate airflow, obsolete hardware, or the immense challenge of containing vapor within a kiln that never ceased its heat? Inform me in the remarks below. I would value hearing your perspectives, and while every clarification possessed some validity, none entirely eliminated the hazard, especially because no one desired to take the blame. The concealed murderer flourished since the framework permitted it. So long as the flame roared and iron remained in yield, contaminated air was regarded as an acceptable toll for sustaining the furnace. But as we are about to discover, most guidance succeeds, but solely in principle. It is now clear that the initial indicators of collapse were easy to overlook. Around 1,910 smelting kilns throughout the industrial heartland were deteriorating under incessant thermal force. Their cores gradually decayed over time while manufacturing persisted. Paradoxically, it is what sustained the skeleton that also functioned tirelessly to enfeeble it. Heat-resistant brick cores disintegrated as liquid metal and dross abraded their facets. Day after day, designers of the era observed that decay was lopsided. This generated fragile zones that took on more heat and tension than the remainder. These frailties seldom revealed themselves at the start. Outer indicators provided only minimal clues. There might have been a faint protrusion in the casing, or a novel shudder sensed through the flooring. Potentially, even a minor change in how warmth spread from a known area. So if the team acquired the skill to spot these alterations, why would they not sound an alarm? Well, as we indicated, halting the chamber for inspection was seldom a choice, and was discouraged. It could have resulted in being sacked. Uncertainties always arose. Was the skeleton still tough enough to hold up, or had it already overstepped a boundary that no one could detect? Sector magazines described kilns functioning for a decade or longer, lacking a total halt far beyond what initial architects had envisioned. Each extra year boosted yield, but it also worsened the concealed harm within the partitions. Restorations were carried out while the blaze persisted in burning. Brick was mended, slabs were bolstered, and leaks were plugged, all within steps of liquefied ore. These actions lessened immediate peril, but did not return the original durability. I believe it is fair to state they gained time, rather than safety. No lone fissure ruined a kiln. Breakdown surfaced from accumulation, from myriad tiny concessions stacked over years of thermal force and load. When containment at last snapped, it frequently startled even skilled technicians. On this occasion, the giant did not collapse abruptly due to lack of care. It broke down because it was compelled to persist, even after its boundaries had degraded beyond the threshold of recovery. Following this is the segment that seldom appears in educational volumes. When the barriers gave way, no siren sounded. Destruction arrived as a violent opening. Smelting chamber breaches were a recognized but poorly forecasted danger. Instances when liquefied iron escaped its vessel and transformed the facility floor into a torrent of blaze. Pause and contemplate that for a brief moment. Being one of these laborers essentially encircled by liquid magma, it is such a terrifying concept to even ponder. Would you not concur the chamber partitions were never intended to be pierced, yet they were required to withstand unceasing thermal tension? When the brickwork internal layers thinned, it triggered a chain reaction. The outer casings warped and force-hunted for the most fragile spot. When that spot collapsed, iron did not merely leak, it flooded. This is where circumstances shift. Foundry workers of that period recounted breaches, where liquefied iron exploded through kiln coverings and surged across grounds, incinerating tracks, pillars, and every other object in its trajectory. The metal chilled only after obliterating what stood before it. By 1915, the United States was running well over 300 functioning smelting chambers across the country according to government inspections. Each one contained thousands of tons of liquefied substance. At any particular time, a lone breakdown was restricted, but alas, the dysfunctional, avaricious framework virtually ensured they would still happen time and again. What rendered these occurrences particularly hazardous was their velocity. Once the vessel failed, there was scant time to respond. Instruction was vital, but gap and fortune often mattered. Even more breaches seldom reached the front pages. Unless casualties occurred more frequently than not, they were integrated into functional recollection as the toll to settle for unceasing manufacturing. This is where most justifications crumble. It typically occurred without notice, and frequently after sunset. In the years shortly before 1920, kiln teams recounted times when a device that had appeared constant abruptly became fierce. The blaze did not quiver, it retaliated like you would not believe. Late shifts were notably at risk. Fewer overseers were on site. Sight was diminished, and weariness hindered a man's promptness. An obstructed drainage port or sudden load disproportion could turn habitual tasks into turmoil. Within only moments, forced air entered chambers at intensities surpassing 18 degrees Fahrenheit, compelling reactions that relied on an exact parity between warmth, circulation, and load. When that parity failed, internal powers swelled erratically. Architects noted that load could change path within the chimney, thrusting gases and liquefied substance toward gaps, never intended to discharge them. Up to this point, this seems uncomplicated. But during this era, dozens of grave kiln outbursts and fierce gas discharges happened every year. Across American metal territories, certain events flung wreckage across casting grounds, while others sent flames erupting from loading stages or vents. Fundamentally, these laborers were trapped in a real-life horror. What rendered these nights vivid was how rapidly they occurred. Once the kiln reacted, there was no slow buildup. The men fled for their lives, obscured by brightness and fumes. It was solely due to their sharp wits and closeness, with the sight that they were able to get away unharmed. Many occurrences concluded without deaths, but certainly not without havoc. They were recorded, analyzed, and then excused as functional expenses. The kiln was fixed, reignited, and for whatever motive relied upon once more. The apparatus resisted because it had been driven into a condition of constant strain. It did not defy out of spite, but out of physical laws, reminding those nearby that authority was always tentative. And we are about to see what appeared habitual was anything but. This might seem improbable to accept, but halting the chamber was actually viewed as the most perilous deed of all. Iron crafters had decades of expertise, indicating that cessations carried hazards as grave as any breach. What looked like prudence often led to disaster. A total cessation required weeks of regulated cooling. Architects cautioned that once chilled, a kiln might never be safely restarted. Which path would you have selected in their position? Fiscal strain bolstered good dread. Government reports revealed that American pig iron yield surpassed 39 million tons by 1917, fueled in part by military necessity. kilns were compelled to stay online because domestic output relied on their persistence. There were many instances where chilled chambers fractured internally, showing harm only after attempts were made to light them again. Certain units necessitated partial destruction, and though infrequent others were discarded completely, the monetary deficits were substantial, enough to sway the industry-wide functional mindset. Directors, therefore, preferred basic mending, while persisting with work instead of totally shutting down. These measures curtailed immediate risk, but maintained the fundamental bet. Who actually gained from this setup? The reasoning was self-validating. The longer a kiln functioned, the more expensive cessation became. Each extra year heightened reliance on unceasing fire, making the notion of stopping feel foolhardy rather than careful. They did not decline to stop because they overlooked peril. They declined because stopping had been designed into a hazard no one felt they could withstand, and because, in my view, as illogical as it sounds, it is human tendency to let greed outstrip caution. The following point alters how we should interpret everything that succeeds it. Detriment was knitted into the labor long before it made headlines. Wounds were common enough to be anticipated. Sears, broken limbs, and gas contact were debated in realistic terms, as if they were work-related certainties. One could say they viewed mishaps to be tutorials in method, rather than breakdowns of the framework itself. The magnitude of workforce intensified the count. By 1920, over 250,000 men were hired in iron and steel manufacturing countrywide, with the bulk of those specifically in or near kiln tasks. Even a tiny fraction of occurrences resulted in thousands of lives changed. So why did men continue to appear? I believe the laborers working in this sector likely felt they possessed no other option. They had dependents to support with restricted prospects and expertise, yet even as men felt confined by situation, the truth was that protection was always a bargain between what was achievable and what was allowable. Safety steps were present, but they were constrained by engineering and habit. Guarded garments provided minimal shielding, and breathing protection was infrequent. Instruction stressed watchfulness and skill. Presuming peril could be steered through consciousness alone. When casualties happened, probes often concentrated on direct triggers. It was always attributed to the same factors: a slip, a late action, or a broken part. The relentless framework itself was never held accountable. Towns had no alternative but to endure these losses silently. Kinships adapted, firms took on new hands, and chambers continued to glow. The unceasing work bolstered the notion that individual existences, though prized, were secondary to the task as a whole, and the loop would persist endlessly. Magnitude became the new menace. During the 20 seconds, smelting chambers increased in size, height, and yield as American manufacturing surged in what they deemed to be effectiveness. What had once been perilous tools became something closer to bottled power. Structure modifications vowed for steadiness. Kilns grew in elevation and floor space, permitting more substance to be treated without break. These enhancements boosted output, but they also pooled warmth and load within buildings, already functioning close to their peaks. By 1925, the United States ran more than 400 smelting chambers. Throughout the land, many of them notably bigger than those constructed at the start of the century. Each unit contained more liquid iron, more gas, and more latent power than ever before. Here is the bit people typically overlook. There was unceasing friction among the laborers, doubting whether engineering at last outran the scope for human oversight. Trade papers mirrored this friction. Essays lauded record yields, while alerting that crisis reaction speeds had not advanced. At the same rate, the chamber was becoming too massive to escape, too potent to easily control. Once an error occurred, directorial habit transformed far too sluggishly. Was this intentional? Or was it disregard? Yes, methods did progress, but the underlying belief stayed. That unceasing functioning was both vital and doable. Bigger chambers bolstered that trust by working most of the time. When crashes did happen, inquiries often mentioned intricate ties rather than straightforward errors. Warmth spread inner lining wear. Load, disproportion, and worker reaction all played parts. No lone element clarified why some kilns failed drastically, while others survived. What is occurring here is not transparent. Vigor arrived at a snapping point not because it missed data, but because expansion intensified every result. Each boost carried concealed burden, and each ton of joined volume narrowed the gap between authority and doom. The chambers did not vanish. They changed by the early 1930s. The metal sector had outlasted turns of expansion, downfall, and improvement, bringing along harsh tutorials written in warmth and deficit. The smelting chambers stayed, but the fantasy of total authority did not. Build enhancements gradually included what trial had shown: superior lining substances. Better airflow and more orderly tracking curtailed some perils. Yet the main rule persisted, and the same blunders were committed. Government work reports from the early slump years display yield dropping sharply. But chambers that stayed active continued to run for long cycles, rather than frequent cessations. Even in shrunken trades, halting totally was shunned whenever feasible. And while deadly mishaps decreased over time, they never disappeared. Outbursts, gas events, and build breakdowns persisted in showing in work papers, recounted with rising complexity but known results. What altered most was view. Early kilns had been hailed as icons of advancement. By the years between wars, they were seen as frameworks that required deference. Rather than hope, risk was no longer hidden, but it stayed rooted. Rules increased. Work norms tightened and safety habit grew. Yet none wiped out the basic truth of liquefied iron, contained in place by human engineering. Authority grew, yet trust did not. The heritage of the smelting chamber remains in modern metalcraft, in the view that some devices cannot be made benign, only overseen the unceasing fire left behind. More than iron, it left a tutorial carved into work history. That persistence without modesty invites ruin, and that advancement often moves forward by discovering how near it has already been to wreck. I trust you found this account to be deep and engaging. There are so many tutorials to be gained from the past, though. As we progress into a constantly shifting world, we witness the same elements of greed and finance, dominating over the price of human existences. Perhaps one day we will grasp the point.